evening, friends, and welcome to the Mythic Imagination. For the past few years of my life, I've lived on the Navajo Reservation in the Four Corners area of Arizona. I'm also an adopted member of a family of the Sinchagu Lakota Oyate in Rosebud, South Dakota, and a firekeeper for my family's Sundance ceremony. So I have been privileged to hear many stories coming out of the Native American oral tradition. And more often than not, these are stories peopled by a multitude of animals. And in them, animals speak a language, and human beings understand them. They not only communicate to humans via language, they often save human beings from their own follies, and some even invite them, the humans, to live with them in their dens and burrows and adopt them as their own. Humans transforms into animals and animals into humans. Animal species are called nations, and people take on animal names. In some of the stories of origins, the humans are actually descended from the animal nations, and so are indeed relations in both a biological and a spiritual sense. Humans have a treaty, an understanding with the animal nations, a mutual respect and reciprocity of honor and duty. And this sharing of a language, these intimate bonds between animals and humans, the ease with which humans and animals can transform and morph into one another, are symbols of an elemental harmony that exists between the human being and all forms of life. In other words, these storytellers understood themselves as being part of that animal nature and that animal realm, and they understood this common nature was shared by all sentient and rational beings. Yet in spite of this history of intimacy between humans and animals, in spite of the fact that even today most the public professes to see their pets as members of the family, we as a consumer-based and industrialized civilization have initiated the greatest mass extinction of animals in the history of our planet. In our own country, the inhumane and often unethical confinement of animals on a mass scale to meet the dietary needs of a rising population is resulting in the suffering of animals on a scale far greater than any past cruelties, real or imagined. Now, all of these ambiguities really attest to our increasingly complicated and often contradictory relationship to animals. In today's program, we will examine this question and explore the newly developing field of animal rights and animal ethics. I will be joined by two prominent scholars from Humboldt State University who are in the process of revising the third edition of their groundbreaking textbook, The Animal Ethics Reader. I hope that you enjoyed the program. Thank you. Good evening, friends, and welcome to the program. My name is Lynn Hubbard, and this is the Mythic Imagination. I'm going to be joined this evening by two retired professors from Humboldt State University, Professor Emeritus Susan Armstrong, who was a 2004 outstanding professor at Humboldt State University, and she is published widely on animal ethics and affiliated subjects. Also, we're joined this evening by Professor Richard Botzler, who is also a retired professor from the Wildlife Department at Humboldt State University, and he's a leading published expert in the field. In 2004, he and Susan also edited Environmental Ethics, Divergence, and Convergence. Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Lynn.
We're glad to be here.
Yeah,
thank you for the invitation.
So, did the two of you meet actually at Humboldt State University?
Who do you want to have answer?
You.
Yes, yes, we did meet there.
Okay.
And we found that we had a common interest in the fields of animals, the environmental ethics, and so forth. So we began to kind of intermingle in our teaching, and eventually it developed into a formal team editing approach.
And what department were you teaching at the
I'm
time?
in philosophy.
Oh, in the philosophy department. Very interesting. And what about you, Rick? What were you doing when the two of you met?
Well, I taught a class, I explored the class in environmental ethics. I was hired to teach wildlife diseases, which I did, but I was just intrigued by some very different perspectives with regard to animals that our students encountered as they were kind of getting ready and going into the field. And so I thought, well, it might be good to talk about some of the variation in perspectives that we have in society. And so I taught then a class where I tried to cover anthropocentrism, animal rights and animal liberation, ecocentrism. Didn't get into ecofeminism initially. Eventually we added that. And after I taught that class, I think a second time, somebody said, well, there's a person in philosophy who's a real animal rights advocate, and you might want to ask her to come. And I was very nervous, but I thought, well, all right, I'll give this a shot. And so I contacted Susan and nervously said, you know, I'm teaching a class on wildlife ethics, I think is what I called it. And would she be willing to come in and represent the perspective that she has? And she graciously did come in. She was very good, very scholarly, you know, very articulate. It was not that was just a hardcore advocacy, but she really got us thinking about it. And very graciously, I think in a following semester or two, when she taught a class in, I think animal rights it was, then she also invited me to come and talk about primarily ecocentrism, the Aldo Leopold perspective, which then I was glad to do. We then, I'm not sure how often that exchange occurred, but then we continued to develop a relationship, and eventually we had the opportunity to offer a course together. And so that was one of the most difficult parts of my life, to sit there and to talk with someone who I knew was very different from my perspectives and the team teach a class. And surprisingly, it went, you know, very well. We had some real differences, but Susan is very respectful, scholarly, but she can certainly stand her ground. She can say the things that she wants to very well. And I struggled to also represent my perspective, and we continued to go through the semester, and amazingly, it seemed to work out pretty good. Wow. And so we did it again.
Well, that's very interesting. So the course started out as a course actually in the philosophy department, but it was, had you actually taught a course already on animal rights before this?
Well, I think under a different name, yes, but that was an area, yes.
So the collaboration started as a collaboration between a professor in the philosophy department and a professor in the wildlife department. And you were, what was your interest in philosophy? What did you?
Well, I have ethics in general, feminist philosophy, process philosophy.
You had a strong Whiteheadian background, I think.
Whiteheadian process philosophy, yeah.
Interesting. The last of a dying breed, a Whiteheadian.
Well, I hope it's not a dying breed. But I did want to say that to me, team teaching with someone like Rick is just the best situation for teaching. It's so rich. I have learned so much, and our students seem to have been very, very happy. Yeah.
Oh, so this has been a very good experience. And obviously that's the case, because I tell you, this book that the two of you did on animal ethics, it's really, really a fascinating book. And one of the things I find so fascinating about it is this multiple perspective that the book demonstrates. The introduction, that general introduction that you did on the history of the field, where you specifically spoke about the human's relationship to animals in terms of philosophy and theology, I thought was very, very fascinating introduction, and I learned a lot from it. And we should probably say up front that you are not simply a retired professor in the philosophy department, but you're currently the priest in charge at the Christ Episcopal Church in Eureka. So you came at the field from both a philosophical and a religious point of view.
Yes, yeah.
And I know that Rick has a background in religion, that he was raised in the Lutheran church, and
Right.
is still a practicing Lutheran at Grace Good Shepherd in McKinleyville. And so how do you think that, what's been the role of religion, do you think, in the field of animal ethics traditionally?
What's been the role of what?
Religion.
Oh, religion.
Yeah.
Well, religion has not always played a helpful role, but to really address that, we'd have to look at the whole history of human culture, because religion has been present there from the very, very, very beginning. And when I was looking back at the history, particularly of Christianity, which I'm familiar with, and Judaism, it's quite amazing to see that there are, all along the way, there were individual people who cared very much about animals and who expressed that in their writing and in their practice. But that, well, I don't want to anticipate your question. Go ahead.
Well, maybe just to kind of build on what Susan is saying, I think that she gave a good insight there. For me, much of religion or religious experience is that when you have, say, a culture or a prophet who hears a religious perspective, who perhaps hears the voice of God, it's often really focused on kind of one of two things. Either it is then interpreting the relation between the human and the divine, what God expects from humans or what humans are hoping for from God, or it is really some overviews on the relationship between people, what God expects us in terms of how we treat other people, and how and what human relations should be. But almost any relationship, say, to animals is really secondary to that. And I mean, you have laws related to animal use, but even those are really, in a sense, part of the human divine or human to human relation. And it's hard, I think, to really interpret or to get a real foundation of what is the role of religion with animals other than in these secondary ways. We can say that, that if we love the Creator, we'll take care of the creation, which includes the animals. But that is really not, in my understanding, really so much what much of the divine word is about. It's about the human divine and about the human-human relation that's being addressed, and that where guidelines are given or interpretations are made.
I thought one of the interesting parts of that introduction that you wrote, Susan, was when you spoke about the historical perspective, and you traced this relationship between the human and the animal realm back into ancient Egypt and ancient Greece. You said that in ancient Egypt there was the belief that creatures were manifestations of the divine, and that even in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, that there were prohibitions against the mutilation of animals. And so this respect for the animal, this idea that the animal was really the locus of even the sacred, is a very, very ancient idea. And it's one that I would like to pick up on and share with you, an idea coming out of Joseph Campbell that perhaps can spark some imaginative conversation here, because I find this relationship between the human and the animal to be one of not only interest, but an extremely fascinating and important topic for us today. Because I think, some people would want to make the argument that, what happens now to our animal species at this time, this period of human history, is going to say not only a lot about us, but if the animals go the way of all flesh, we are going to go the way of all flesh. So this concern about animal and animal rights and the whole field of animal ethics is really a part of a much larger ecological concern that's very important for our future. So let me share with you, I would really, a quote from Joseph Campbell. You know, I've always been very interested in Joseph Campbell, who was a great mythologist in the last century, and he wrote this fascinating work that he called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And right at the end of that book, the last couple pages of that book, he speaks about the role of animals in the development of religious consciousness. He writes, and he's writing here about Paleolithic times, and he says that for the primitive hunting peoples, the saber-toothed tiger, the mammoth, the lesser animals were the primary manifestations of what was alien, the source of at once danger but also sustenance. And then he speaks about it also not simply that animals were the sources of danger and sustenance, but he says they also participated in the realm of mystery, and they were the center of gravity for hunting and gathering communities. And so he's making the argument here that the animal was really the locus of the sacred itself. He goes on to say that an unconscious identification took place, that the animals became the tutors of humanity, and that we actually learned about the divine life from animals themselves. We became cathected with the animal, and that's a very fascinating perspective because, it points to this important role that animals have played in our history, and not simply as something to eat, not simply as companions, not simply as pets, not simply as beasts of burden, but that the animals themselves have traditionally been understood, at least in earth-based religions, as a locus of the sacred. And that's quite a different understanding that usually comes out of a Christian perspective.
Yes, and what you're saying prompted a couple of thoughts. One is that we have to remember that the current situation, which Rick has sketched, which is that human beings are kind of where it's at, is only since about the 16th or 17th centuries. If we look at the Christian and Hebrew scriptures, we can see that the creation was a manifestation of the divine, not simply limited to human beings at all, but the entire manifestation of the divine. And only in those period of the 16th and 17th centuries, when we started developing modern science and capitalism and so forth, did we see the focus so incessantly on the human being. And one thing that strikes me is, when you were talking, is how little children love animals so much, and they're so focused, and probably because of what you were suggesting, there's something of the sacred in the animal that children respond to. In our own time, some people have referred to animals as our spiritual guides. So we're kind of coming back to that we can have the guides from the animal of unconditional love, of loyalty, of courage, and so forth.
Yeah, and you often hear people speak about animals, especially dogs, right?
Yeah.
The unconditional love of the dog.
Yeah.
Well, the only other being that we say that loves us unconditionally, maybe, hopefully, might be our mother, right? But is God, right?
Yeah.
And God, of course, as the joke goes, is dog spelled backwards, right? So
Right.
Isn't it interesting that still today we have this idea that that in the animal realm is still is the locus of the sacred.
Yes.
It's very
yes.
fascinating.
Yes.
And it's so interesting to me because then, of course, we also have the contradictory idea, right? Like you say, coming out of the Reformation, coming out of this philosophical duality of the 16th and 17th century, where, well, it's really humans that are the measure of all things, right? That value doesn't reside in nature, right?
Right.
That value is always tied up with with reasonability, with speech, with moral responsibility, and that it's only human beings that have a soul. And that's a qualitative difference then.
Right.
And that's really this anthropocentrism that you're talking
Right.
about that's coming out of the Reformation. But I mean, that's quite a different take on an animal than what came before it, right? Because as you point out, going all the way back to pre-Socratic philosophy, in Greek culture, the idea that many of these people were vegetarians.
Yes.
And many of these people still had this notion of the reverence of the animal.
Yeah.
And not only that, an animal was a sentient being, a being of feeling, but that an animal also had a soul. That
Yeah.
an animal also had reasonability.
Yeah.
And that's a very powerful notion, but you can trace historically
Yes.
how this idea, this intimate relationship, this sacred relationship really with the animal, then over the course of time in Western culture led to quite a different state of affairs, right?
Yep. Yep.
And that's interesting. I mean, do you think, Rick, that if the farther the creator is removed from creation, then the more difficult it is for the animal, if you will. That if we understand that if the locus of value actually resides in nature itself and not just in the human being, right? Mm-hmm. So, and part of, I think, what that means is that then, the creator and the creation are very close together. Mm-hmm. Throughout the history of natural mm-hmm. theology in the church, one always gets this idea that, well, there was a locus of revelation that was apart from nature, and that helped remove the creator from the creation. Does this mm-hmm. make sense, what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And so this part of this ambiguity that we have with animals is directly related to the development of our religious consciousness over time. Mm-hmm. And now we seem to be moving perhaps in developing a new consciousness here about
yes, I
our
hope
relationship.
So. I certainly
And
hope
you certainly have someone like St. Francis who had a
Yeah.
very strong
Yes.
connection with animals and with nature. Mm-hmm.
Christianity, I think, has certainly been a sort of mixed bag, both for human beings and for animals. This whole Abrahamic tradition and monotheism, this idea that the human being is the center of creation, and that nature was created for the human being, and that animals were created to sustain the human being. And this monotheistic anthropocentrism, I think, has had a very debilitating effect upon animals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's true, and I think that historically, through much of, say, the traditional interpretations in Judaism and Christianity, is that humans have been seen as really the culmination of God's creative work, and that the others were produced for human value, for human use. And I think that in more recent Christianity, that's been questioned increasingly. And I think that as with the one notion that if we love the Creator, we love the creation, that's been part of it. But you also brought up some very interesting perspectives, say, among the Native Americans with whom you were associated, in which there was such a very strong connection to the natural world. And I think that in Judaism and Christianity, we're not quite there yet. But that's, I think, something that is also challenging the thinking in Judaism and Christianity as well.
Well, the Lakota Sioux have a one-word prayer, and they use this prayer in many different aspects of their life, but every time you go into a sweat lodge, you always, when you go in, you say metakwiyase, and when you come out, you say metakwiyase. And metakwiyase is a word that means we are all related the two-legged, the four-legged, that, you know, we are all creatures of the divine life, and we must always love and respect one another. But I think that this is a very powerful idea within the Native American community, that you know, human beings are not the pinnacle of creation. That, you know, this whole created order was not for the human being. That we are a two-legged animal nation, just like horses are a four-legged animal nation, right? And I think that's a very powerful notion. That's a very powerful idea. But like you say, you know, going all the way back to the St. Francis and the early saints, there's always been this other aspect of Christianity that has really been resurrected in the present concerning that the locus of the sacred can also be manifested in animals, and that in our relationship with animals, we can actually experience the love of God, the love of the Creator, and that's a very a powerful idea. And you know, if that is the way that you feel about an animal, you aren't necessarily going to eat it, or abuse it. Certainly, right?
Right.
I remember I grew up on a farm in southern Indiana, and it was just at a time, I was like the last generation in which the farm was still somewhat functioning, right? And we had wonderful animals there. We had wonderful relationships with animals, right? There were animals that we hunted, right? There were animals that we raised and ate, right? My grandfather raised bird dogs. He had trained bird dogs,
Right.
pointers and setters, to hunt, and then we would sell them to the rich doctors and lawyers in town, right? And then, you know, I would have my own little dogs and animals. I had my own hunting dogs, beagles for rabbits, but then I had another dog that was my personal dog that lived in the house with me, right? So even though we were raised in a plethora of animals around us, right? There was a pecking order there, right? I mean, there's no way that I would kill my little toy Manchester Frisky that lived with me. He was my pet, right? And we certainly treated the hunting dogs quite different than we treated the pigs or the cows, which we would slaughter and either sell or consume. And so this relationship that we have with animals in the modern world, I think, is really a very fascinating, and it's a very complex subject.
Well, you bring up an interesting thing, because I think much of what you describe is based on our experience with animals. And when we have experiences with animals, we develop relations with them. And so we get that connection. And that kind of erodes just that simple anthropocentrism, that human superiority. There's also been kind of the more philosophical or analytical challenges to anthropocentrism, as, for example, with animal rights and animal liberation, ecocentrism, ecofeminism, and those also have challenged it. So I think from both that experiential, intuitive, relational, as well as the analytical, I think there's been a pretty strong challenge to the traditional anthropocentrism that we really have had for such a long time in our society.
Well, I thought it was interesting that in the introduction to the book, you talked about how organized animal welfare movement started already in the 19th century. And certainly it seems today, I mean, you could hardly turn on television without watching a commercial, right, for the ACPA on cruelty to animals. This must be stopped, right? And so in the last couple decades, it would seem that our concern for animals is on the uprise, if you will.
Yes, very much so. As you say, in the middle to the late 19th century, there was a concern of some in England in particular for the treatment of horses who would be whipped even though they were down and exhausted and so forth. and William Wilberforce, the great British reformer, worked very hard against the slave trade, but he was also concerned about animal welfare. So there have been people increasingly. Now, some people think that the world wars in the 20th century kind of set that movement back because there was so much suffering everywhere.
So much human suffering.
Yeah, human suffering.
Yeah.
But then starting in the 60s, you got these liberation movements for women, minorities, and animals. And Peter Singer wrote the famous book, 1975, Animal Liberation. As some people say, it was the first philosophical text that had recipes, but of course they were vegetarian.
Yeah, interesting.
And so that has continued, and there are many, many groups that are concerned with farm animals, with marine animals, and of course, domestic animals, and so on. There's a lot of concern, and I think that these things have been successful. In fact, in a number of times, the public has been ahead of the scientific community in being concerned about animal suffering. For example, in California, a law was passed some time ago, Proposition 2, which outlawed hens being in what's called battery cages, in these little tiny cages. And more recently, at least some of the states have outlawed putting pigs in in confinement, in extreme confinement. And in general, I would say that the United States is behind Europe. Europe's legislative provision for the welfare of farm animals is beyond that of the United States.
What do you think that is?
Well, I think that there is, I don't want to say anything bad about the United States, but I think that there is focus on how much money we're going to get out of the treatment of the animals.
So with the rise of the corporate state, with corporate animal farming, with millions and millions of dollars being poured into biomedical research, right? This has led to the cruelty to animals, because the animal itself is seen as a mere economic commodity.
Yes, yes. I'm waiting for my thought to come back.
Well, that's okay. Yeah. What do you think about that, Rick? Do you think that is part of the modern dynamic, the plight of the animal?
Well, generally, yes. I guess I'd have to think a little bit more about what Susan said. I think that she has some good ideas. I guess I'd like to sort of cogitate a little bit more on that.
Okay. Well,
I know what I was going to say.
Go ahead.
So what I was going to say is that in this country, the general public has been beyond the positions that professionals in the field have sometimes been willing to take. For example, the focus on the welfare of pigs has been not supported by the farm industry, and yet nevertheless people have been organizing for farm animal welfare. And so in any case, I do think that you can think about the treatment of cetaceans,
or primates, yeah. Maybe just to follow up a little bit, though, I think part of what you're kind of bringing out is that, and kind of using the term that these large corporations, is that that often the finances are a really significant part of the decisions that they make, is that they need to make a profit for their shareholders, and so they're going to be looking to, in a sense, have the most competitive product for the lowest price. And if they've got to be providing extra care, more care for animals, more space, better nutritional food, dealing with the behavioral needs of the animals. And that's often, I think, an important thing, is that they're, rather than just commodities, is to recognize that they do have minds, they have autonomy, that they really have experiences, and to accommodate that, that becomes a lot more expensive. And I think there's a lot of resistance to that, and I think that there is, I'm still cogitating a little bit there, say the difference with England. If it's just that the corporations are more powerful here, if it's that the people are more stronger advocates there, in England, I'm not sure, but I think that part of the reason comes down to that economic.
Well, I mean, the liberation of slaves was also led by England.
Yes, it's very similar.
Before,
So, thinking again about the United States right now, what you have is public pressure and public concern pushing some of these corporations. For example, McDonald's is, I think, I'm not sure exactly what the status of that is, but they pledged that they were not going to buy eggs from companies that confine hens to that degree.
Right.
And so you have public pressure on SeaWorld, for example, using animals in exhibits and so forth. So it is going to be public pressure, which is maybe going to save the animals, and because it does hit the corporations where it hurts.
Well, and along with that is that, we as consumers are constantly making choices. We're buying.
Yeah.
So whether I buy free-range chicken eggs or whether I buy the regular eggs, whether I buy organic or the less expensive. And I think that we as consumers really play an important role. And I sometimes think that we're maybe more effective than the news really says about American consumers.
Power to the people. If you don't like the way animals are being treated, don't consume animals. Don't buy the product if you have reason to believe that it's not healthy, or that there's an animal that's being harmed and treated as a mere commodity. It's very fascinating that I grew up on a farm not that long ago, and even though we raised pigs and cattle that we were going to slaughter, we were going to sell, some of it we were going to consume, some of it, but most of it we were going to sell. So we were using farm animals as commodity, but yet we still had a relationship with
That's right.
with
That's
these
an important
beings.
point, I think.
I mean, there's no way that we would treat even our chickens. We wouldn't treat like these large corporate farming conglomerates. And the idea of inflicting pain on an animal, as often happens with biomedical research. I mean, we would not think about treating an animal like that, because we loved animals. We had relationships with them. Bessie the cow, If you have 20 or 30 head of cattle, you can know these cattle, You have a living relationship. And when that breaks down, when animals become merely a commodity, right?
Right.
Then, I would want to make the argument that, that's a spiritual problem. Because in a very profound ways, animals make us human beings. I spent 5 years out on the Navajo reservation as the executive director of the Navajo Lutheran Mission. And there were many, many animals, many feral horses, right? I was raised, everywhere I looked, there were animals, right? The mission was out in the middle of nowhere, so people would drop off their stray animals with us, right? And so, it was either kill these animals, let them starve to a death, or take care of these animals. So, like I said, I grew up on a farm. My grandpa raised dogs all the time. So I raised many generations of dogs, right? But it was a difficult ministry, as you can imagine. The Navajo Nation is very impoverished. We were running maybe 60, 70% unemployment. It was in the middle of nowhere. We had a health clinic and a school, and about probably 30% of the children that went to that school had no running water or electricity, right? So, that was a difficult ministry to have for five years, my wife and I. But I found great, tremendous comfort in having my relationship with my dogs.
Right.
Do you know? And I never in my life ever had the idea that an animal was not a sentient being. Or that an animal, and by sentient I mean a feeling being, right? An emotional being, right? But there was never a doubt in my mind that animals lacked reason. Now, maybe you couldn't discuss a proposition of Wittgenstein with my beagle, right? But this was certainly a sentient, reasonable being that expressed love, that could give love,
Right.
and that received love. And just living in that close proximity with animals has, as I often say, it helped me be a human being. Do you know, there's something about being a human being. There's something of our spiritual essence that we need these creatures for our own enjoyment, for our own spiritual edification.
Well, they can certainly enhance that
Yeah.
sense of humanity and that
Yeah.
sense of connection to the natural world.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. Well, let me share with you a quote here from zoologist and philosopher Neil Everdern. I'm sure that you folks are familiar with him, right? And this quote comes from a marvelous book called A Language Older Than Words. And this book was written by Derek Jensen, who I think actually came and gave a talk here once or twice at Humboldt State University. But it's a marvelous book called A Language Older Than Words. And he's in the introduction to that work, he speaks about Neil Everdern. May I share this with you?
Sure.
Because I think that this is really a lot of people, he's expressing here how a lot of modern people feel about what's going on in our treatment of animals. He says, the zoologist and philosopher Neil Everdern tells the familiar story of how we silence the world. During the 19th century, many vivisectionists routinely severed the vocal cords before operating on an animal. This meant that during the experiment, the animals could not scream. By cutting the vocal cords, experimenters simultaneously denied reality by pretending a silent animal feels no pain, and they affirmed it by implicitly acknowledging that the animal's cries would have told them what they already knew, that the creature was a sentient feeling being. As Everdern comments, he says, quote, "The rite of passage into the scientific way of being centers on the ability to apply the knife to the vocal cords, not just of the dog on the table, but of life itself. Inwardly, the modern human being must be able to sever the cords of his own consciousness. And outwardly, the effect must be the destruction of the larynx of the biosphere, an action essential to the transformation and the turning of the world into a material object." And I found that a very, very powerful quote. And, how could we consume these animals? And why should we consume these animals if we knew how horrible conditions in which these animals are being subjected to?
Mere awareness will not do it, I'm sorry to say. Our species can close its mind to anything that makes it uncomfortable. Sorry to say. So that's where I think religious development helps people as they develop community with other people and other animals, that helps them develop their own empathy and compassion, which have to be there.
Yeah, I think what you quoted is actually not for eating, but rather for medical research that was done.
Yeah.
And I think in retrospect, it's hard to imagine, why we would do something like that, and the thinking that goes through it. And part of it is that probably, and I think you can get used to something. If you do something enough, it's not so hard to do. I think, though, that also just maybe it might be worth pointing out that not necessarily every scientist would share that perspective, is that you had cases where that was done and where those animals were very badly abused in that way. But I think that certainly within the sciences, within the medical communities, you often have considerable discussion and disagreement on issues like that. And that is, to me, a real extreme example of a very unfortunate direction that some scientists, some medical researchers took. I sometimes think that, how much of what I do today will be in 50 or 100 years look back upon and say, that was really kind of primitive, and why would you do that? And in terms of dietary things, in terms of just the clothes I wear, and how they're produced, they'll
Who
say
eats frog legs? Yeah.
that's right. Why would people ever have thought to do that?
Right.
So I mean,
Yeah.
I recognize that I'm
Well, they
also
didn't have to, right?
that I'm also vulnerable to
Sure.
judgments from
Sure.
the future.
Sure.
But I think in
Sure.
retrospect, it's quite clear to us that it was really an awful, a terrible sort of thing.
Yeah, and
happened.
well, on the other side of the coin, you often hear people make the arguments that, well, we have to, if we stopped experimenting on animals, then this would end human suffering. But then, of course, that argument goes right back to what we were talking about earlier, right? That, well, does the human being have the right to inflict pain on a sentient being simply because they have the power and the will to? Is that a moral act?
Yes, I think a helpful moral principle is to avoid causing any unnecessary suffering. The problem is, of course, with defining unnecessary. But I think that is a good general guidepost for all of these questions. And a lot of the pain we cause to animals is not necessary by any stretch of the imagination.
I think there is really greater consciousness, and the general trend is to use animals less, to take them more into consideration. We probably have a long way to go to where we ultimately could go. But I think that increasingly the public, whether they be the general public, whether they be professionals, are looking more and more to alternatives and maybe really just questioning some of the things that we've taken for granted in the past.
Well, I heard recently something I thought was very unique, and you'll have to tell me whether this is actually the case or not. But I heard that recently in India, dolphins were granted human rights. Have you heard anything about that?
In India?
Yeah.
There's been some place, I think, that cetaceans have had some additional
Yeah,
rights.
but that's a little too broad. I think it's a little bit more, there have been courts here and there in the world, but I don't think that is generally accepted at this point.
No, I think certainly not generally accepted, and I've not heard that specific case, but it seems that there's been some place where that has been addressed.
Yeah, that's a fascinating idea, because for goodness sakes, if a non-human entity like a corporation can be granted personhood for goodness sakes,
or
right?
a ship.
Yeah, or a ship, right? Then why shouldn't a sentient, rational being?
Why indeed?
This is a fascinating field, isn't it?
Well, and the response to that comes from those who are benefiting from that sentient being. So those, for example, who eat dolphins are going to be really very much opposed to that.
Do you think that an ape or a dolphin can be considered a person?
Well, that of course gets to the definition of personhood, and I'm going to defer to Susan on that.
Well,
but but part of the person is the sense of autonomy, of having a sense of purpose, of having direction, of that things matter to it, and how you define that, I'm not sure. But certainly, the primates are very similar to humans in so many of their qualities. Cetaceans are really very complex. Their languages, their emotion, the emotions of both sides are very complex. So I think that's, to the extent that we move, that's going to be the areas where that will be the directions I think that humans will perhaps extend some concern for personhood and including the legal changes that might accompany.
Sometimes people will use the term quasi-person, and I think that certainly we should. But when we set the bar so high, a lot of human beings would not be able to go over the bar.
Sure.
So we have to.
You mean to qualify for personhood?
That's and to be intelligent and so on. If you set it so high that we're talking about logical reasoning, mathematics, and so on, there are many people who would not be considered persons.
There's no clear boundary between human capacity and the capacity of other species. I mean, this is the reality of it. And the question is that we've arbitrarily, of course, said our species is most important over the years, but I think that there's no easy way to justify a superiority of some kind over other species. And partly, I think we're coming to look at other species in terms of, well, what are their qualities? Not do they match us, but what are their qualities? How can we, in a sense, accommodate those and perhaps respect them for the qualities that they have? So, whether it be a squirrel or whether it be a lizard or an ape or cetacean, they have different qualities. And I think that we can, as we learn more about them, find ways in which we can maybe respect those qualities, respect those creatures for the qualities that they do have.
Well, this in the Renaissance and even in the 17th and 18th century, where you get these this great dualism coming out of the Cartesian philosophy and all of this. Right? I think part of that dualism had affected this relationship between sentience, emotion, feeling, and reason. And because how can you really accept on an abstract philosophical for the level, for the sake of argument, make a distinction between any emotion and a thought, or an emotion and an articulation of reason? I think that's very, very sketchy, and the idea that a being can be sentient, feeling, right? But not reasonable, I think is really a bogus distinction. And what if you really believed that the more reasonable the human being became, the more rational the human being became, right? The less sentient the human being becomes. And so it's the human being that's losing their relationship with themselves, with animals, with the rest of the natural world, right? With the water, with the air, and that this loss of a very basic spirituality that was always present in earth-based spiritualities is really going to bring about not only the extermination of many animal species, but perhaps even ourselves. And that's one of the reasons why I think this is such an important topic. And this book, Animal Ethics, that you put together is really a wonderful, marvelous book. And I really appreciate what the two of you have done to prompt these conversations for us. I think it's really it was a spiritual endeavor, and I really appreciate you coming here to the program and sharing your thoughts and ideas
May I
with us.
say one more thing, commenting. People look at human beings as rational, and I think that's very debatable. Looking at human behavior, are we truly rational? I think we don't qualify.
And could you say a little bit more about that?
Well, we have irrationality. We are destructive to each other, to other beings. We are just, what you were saying, we're destroying the planet as almost as fast as we can. Now that's not rational.
Well, and that's a good point. There's a couple of things to me that play into this. One of them is that we talk about, say, emotion, the emotional or experiencing emotion and being rational. And both of them are, certainly being emotional is contingent on a particular neuroanatomy, is that we have certain brain parts. And we can see, once we've determined that, we can see which other species have it, to what extent. And also, say, just serum chemistry. Different emotions certainly have different chemical responses. The oxytocin, the dopamine, et cetera, serotonin, they all vary with those things. We can see to what extent those are in other species as well. Rationality, to me, is a little bit different. It's a little different brain part, but it's also other species have those things as well to varying degrees. But again, it's kind of putting it down to that we are the standard, and we compare the others to us, rather than saying, well, the squirrel is the standard for squirreliness, and let's respect the qualities of squirreliness, or of cetaceans, or of the alligators, or whatever. I mean, they've got their qualities, and that, to me, it comes down to also seeing them and respecting those qualities, to what extent they have or don't have emotions, and a lot of them appear to what extent they have rationality. Most all of them have some, but whether they have a lot, it seems, doesn't enhance their value, or having little doesn't diminish it.
Yeah, and perhaps ultimately getting back to what you had spoken about earlier in the role of the church or the spiritual community in bringing in enlightenment to this topic, is I've raised so many little dogs in my life, and one thing I know for sure is that these little dogs, from the time that they are born, they have puppy consciousness, which is not individualized, right? When you see little puppies born, the first thing they do, they're all over one another. Here's an arm there, there's a head here from the sister, and all of this, right? And so, animals are, certainly dogs are these wonderful communal beings, right? And it is out of that communality, out of that essence of this wonderful animal community, that they acquire the qualities that we think are godlike. And I found that very profound, what you said, that maybe it's only by when we begin once again to live in spiritual community with one another that we can really bring the truth to bear on oftentimes the silencing of our own barbarity when it comes to animals. Well, thank you so much. It was wonderful, Susan. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for the opportunity.
Yeah, well, this was a great conversation. Thank you very much.
All right.